November 20th, 1943, 0900 hours. Red Beach 2, Tarawa Atoll. Chief Petty Officer Frank Morrison of the 18th Naval Construction Battalion waded through chest-deep water toward a beach, where Marines were still fighting Japanese positions 200 yards inland. Mortar rounds landed in the surf around him. Machine gun fire kicked up water spouts. His construction battalion was supposed to land after the beach was secured, but the assault had bogged down, and the Marines needed an airstrip operational by nightfall, or the next wave of Japanese counterattacks would drive them back into the ocean. Morrison didn't carry a rifle. He carried surveying equipment and blueprints for an airstrip that would have to be carved from coral and sand while men were still dying 50 yards away. Behind him, his Seabees hauled bulldozers and grading equipment through the surf, moving construction machinery onto a hostile beach because the war couldn't wait for safety. A Marine sergeant saw them approaching and shouted over the gunfire, "What the hell are you construction guys doing here? Get back to the transports until we clear this beach." "Can't wait, Sergeant," Morrison shouted back. "We've got fighters inbound in 6 hours and nowhere for them to land. We start building now, or we lose air support." The sergeant stared at the Seabees like they were insane. Construction workers voluntarily landing on a beach still under fire, dragging bulldozers through surf, while Japanese snipers targeted anyone moving. But insanity or not, Morrison's battalion got their equipment ashore, and by 1800 hours, while fighting still raged in parts of Tarawa, the first American fighters were landing on a partially completed airstrip that Seabees had graded, while Marines suppressed Japanese positions with small arms fire. The Marines, who'd joked about construction workers playing soldier, stopped laughing after Tarawa. They'd watched Seabees work under fire with the same determination combat troops showed advancing under fire. The construction crews who got dismissed as non-combatants had proved they'd build whatever the war required, wherever it was needed, regardless of whether the location was safe. For the naval construction battalions, the Seabees, the war would be measured not in enemy killed, but in airstrips built, roads graded, bridges constructed, and ports opened. They would suffer approximately 272 killed in action across the Pacific theater, casualties earned while building under fire rather than fighting with weapons. And when the war ended, the same units that had built infrastructure for military conquest would build infrastructure for humanitarian relief, grading over 5,000 miles of roads across Japan and Pacific Islands to deliver food to millions facing starvation. The battalion nobody wanted. The naval construction battalions were created in 1942 as solution to a problem the Navy hadn't anticipated: how to build the infrastructure that modern mechanized warfare required in forward combat zones. Traditional civilian contractors couldn't work in combat zones. Regular Navy personnel lacked construction expertise. The solution was military units composed of construction workers, trained enough to function under fire, but primarily valued for skills with bulldozers, cranes, and concrete, rather than rifles. The concept produced units that didn't fit standard military categories. Seabees were technically combatants, but primarily builders. They received weapons training, but specialized in engineering. They landed with assault forces, but stayed to build rather than advancing inland. The ambiguity created perception among some combat troops that Seabees were essentially civilians in uniform, construction workers who'd been drafted and given military rank, but weren't real soldiers. The dismissive attitude was particularly common early in the war, before combat troops had experienced the critical importance of having airstrips operational hours after assault, roads graded through jungle within days of landing, ports functional while fighting continued nearby. Marines and infantry who'd fought without adequate logistical support learned to love Seabees. Units that had experienced what rapid construction under fire enabled became fierce defenders of the construction battalions. But the jokes persisted. Construction workers playing soldier, non-combatants who got combat pay, the useless battalion that built things instead of killing enemies. The Seabees heard the jokes and responded with performance that made mockery irrelevant. They built faster than civilian contractors had thought possible. They worked under conditions that would shut down civilian construction sites. They took casualties while building and kept building. The motto, "We build, we fight," wasn't aspirational. It was literal description of what Seabees did across every major Pacific campaign. The combat builders. The Seabee experience in Pacific combat zones documented systematic exposure to danger that contradicted any notion they were rear echelon personnel avoiding risk. Construction battalions routinely landed during assault operations, often within hours of initial waves, and sometimes alongside combat troops when rapid construction was critical to assault success. The statistics of Seabee deployments told story of units that fought the war with construction equipment rather than weapons, but faced enemy fire nonetheless. Across the Pacific Theater from 1942 to 1945, Seabee battalions participated in every major amphibious operation from Guadalcanal through Okinawa. They landed at Tarawa within hours of Marine assault forces and began constructing airstrip, while Japanese positions still commanded parts of the beach. At Saipan, they came ashore on D-Day +1 and started building roads under artillery fire. On Iwo Jima, they landed on D-Day +3 and worked on volcanic sand while Japanese positions in the interior continued shelling the beaches. At Okinawa, they established construction operations within 48 hours of initial landing and worked throughout the 3-month battle. The casualty figures documented the risks Seabees faced while building under fire. Between 1942 and 1945, approximately 272 Seabees were killed in action, not in traditional combat, but while performing construction work in combat zones. Another 2,341 were wounded by enemy action while building airstrips, grading roads, or constructing facilities. The casualties represented construction workers who died or were wounded because building military infrastructure in forward areas required exposure to enemy fire, because construction couldn't wait for safety, because the war moved too fast to separate building from fighting. The construction work itself was extraordinarily difficult even without enemy action. Seabees built in tropical heat and humidity, worked through monsoons, operated heavy equipment in jungle, graded coral that destroyed bulldozer blades, poured concrete in conditions that civilian engineers considered impossible. They worked 12-hour shifts that often extended to 20 hours when deadlines demanded. They built in locations where civilian construction would require months, and did it in days or weeks because military operations couldn't wait. The infrastructure of victory. The construction achievements of Seabee battalions across the Pacific Theater documented organizational capacity that enabled American military success. Without the infrastructure Seabees built, the island-hopping campaign would have stalled. Amphibious operations depended on rapidly establishing airfields, roads, and supply facilities that allowed captured islands to support subsequent operations. The scale of construction was staggering. By war's end in August 1945, Seabee battalions had built approximately 111 major airstrips across the Pacific Theater. Operational airfields constructed on islands where no infrastructure had existed. They graded over 1,000 miles of roads through jungle, over mountains, across coral, through terrain that civilian engineers said was unbuildable. They constructed approximately 400 bridges using whatever materials were available, steel when supplies allowed, timber when steel wasn't available, sometimes improvised structures built from salvaged equipment. They established over 200 major supply depots that could receive, store, and distribute the millions of tons of supplies that sustained American operations. The construction enabled military operations that civilian logistics couldn't have supported. Airstrips operational within days of capture allowed fighter cover for subsequent operations. Roads connected beachheads to interior positions, enabling rapid reinforcement and supply. Bridges allowed heavy equipment to move inland from landing beaches. Supply depots ensured combat units had ammunition, food, and equipment, regardless of how far operations advanced from initial landing sites. The construction was built to military standards rather than civilian standards, functional rather than perfect, adequate rather than elegant, built to last months or years rather than decades. But the structures served their purposes and often exceeded them. Airstrips built for fighters handled bombers. Roads designed for trucks carried tanks. Bridges calculated for specific loads handled heavier equipment. The engineering was sound even when it looked improvised. The transition mission. When Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, CB battalions throughout the Pacific faced radical mission transformation. Units that had spent 3 years building infrastructure for military operations now had to build infrastructure for humanitarian relief and occupation. The skills transferred perfectly. Construction was construction regardless of purpose. But the psychological shift from enabling combat to enabling feeding required adjustment. The need for construction was immediate and overwhelming. Japan's infrastructure had been devastated by American bombing campaigns that destroyed approximately 40% of the urban area in major cities. The rail network was damaged, with approximately 30% of rolling stock destroyed and countless bridges and tunnels collapsed. Roads were crater-filled and blocked by rubble. Ports had been systematically targeted, leaving approximately 80% of port facilities damaged or destroyed. The transportation network that would be necessary to distribute food aid to starving populations simply didn't exist in functional form. Beyond Japan proper, the Pacific Islands that had been Japanese-controlled territory were equally devastated. Islands like Okinawa, Saipan, Tinian, Palau, and scores of smaller atolls had been battlefields where infrastructure was destroyed by combat. The local populations, Japanese settlers, indigenous islanders, and mixed populations, were stranded without functional transportation networks, facing starvation because food couldn't reach them even where supplies existed. The humanitarian crisis demanded rapid restoration of transportation infrastructure on scale that only military engineering units could provide. Civilian reconstruction would take years. American military government didn't have years. It had weeks before mass starvation began killing people by the thousands. The solution was deploying CB battalions to build roads, bridges, and transportation networks as rapidly as they'd built military infrastructure during war. The road-building campaign. The CB construction operations across Japan and Pacific Islands during the 6 months following surrender represented engineering achievement that exceeded anything accomplished during wartime. Building under fire had been dangerous, but relatively simple. Grade an airstrip. Build what's needed. Move to next location. Building for humanitarian relief required coordinated networks that connected ports to interior regions, linked isolated communities to distribution centers, and created systems rather than individual facilities. The scale of construction was documented in reports that CB battalions submitted to naval headquarters. Between September 1945 and March 1946, CB units operating across Japan and Pacific Islands graded approximately 5,000 miles of roads. Not trails or improved paths, but genuine all-weather roads capable of handling heavy truck traffic. They constructed approximately 1,200 bridges, ranging from small stream crossings to major river spans. They rebuilt or repaired approximately 45 port facilities from Yokohama to Okinawa to scattered atolls. They established approximately 200 supply depots and distribution centers where food aid could be stored and dispersed. The construction proceeded at pace that civilian engineering considered impossible. CB battalions working 12-hour shifts could grade a mile of road through moderate terrain in approximately 2 days. Bridge construction that civilian contractors would estimate at weeks was completed in days using materials salvaged from destroyed military equipment, damaged buildings, and whatever else was available. Port repairs that would be major projects for civilian port authorities were accomplished in days by crews that understood the difference between perfect functionality and adequate functionality. The speed was possible because CBs approached construction with military urgency rather than civilian perfectionism. Roads didn't need to last 50 years. They needed to last until Japan rebuilt its own infrastructure. Bridges didn't need to meet peacetime engineering codes. They needed to carry supply trucks without collapsing. Ports didn't need to handle full commercial traffic. They needed to unload food aid quickly enough to prevent starvation. The construction met its purposes, even when it looked improvised. The humanitarian logistics. The roads that CBs built became arteries through which food aid flowed to populations facing starvation. Without the transportation infrastructure, food supplies accumulating at ports couldn't reach interior regions where need was greatest. The construction operations were literally building the logistics networks that would save millions of lives. The scale of food distribution across Japan and Pacific Islands required transportation capacity on unprecedented scale. By early 1946, American occupation forces and international relief organizations were distributing approximately 150,000 tons of food monthly across Japan alone, enough to provide survival rations for approximately 25 million people. Additional food aid flowed to Okinawa, where approximately 300,000 civilians needed external support, and to scattered Pacific Islands, where tens of thousands more depended on American supply lines. The distribution depended entirely on the roads Seabees built. Food arriving at Yokohama port needed roads to reach Tokyo's interior neighborhoods. Supplies landing at Naha needed routes to Okinawa's rural villages. Food destined for Pacific atolls needed roads connecting ports to settlements. Without the transportation infrastructure, the food would sit at ports while people starved miles away. The technical challenges. Building 5,000 miles of roads across Pacific Islands and Japan created engineering challenges that tested even experienced construction battalions. Each region presented unique obstacles that required adaptation and innovation. In Japan's mountainous interior, roads required cutting through terrain that rose steeply from coastal plains. Seabees used bulldozers to carve roads along mountainsides, creating routes that zigzagged up slopes at grades that allowed truck traffic. The work was dangerous. Equipment operators worked on narrow ledges, where mistakes meant losing bulldozers down mountainsides. But the roads opened interior regions that had been isolated since bombing campaigns destroyed rail lines months earlier. On Pacific coral atolls, roads required different approach. Coral surfaces were hard but irregular, requiring extensive grading to create level surfaces. The coral also lacked structural stability, meaning roads needed substantial base preparation to prevent deterioration. Seabees developed techniques for building roads across coral by crushing and compacting coral to create bases, then surfacing with coral gravel that packed into relatively stable driving surfaces. In volcanic regions like Okinawa, the combination of volcanic soil and tropical rainfall created chronic drainage problems. Roads built without adequate drainage would quickly develop washouts that made them impassable. Seabees constructed elaborate drainage systems using culverts salvaged from destroyed infrastructure, creating networks that channeled water away from roadbeds. The construction equipment itself faced extraordinary stress. Bulldozers designed for temperate construction work operated in tropical heat that caused chronic overheating. Coral and volcanic rock destroyed blade edges faster than anticipated, requiring constant sharpening and replacement. Parts and maintenance supplies were limited, forcing crews to cannibalize damaged equipment to keep operational machines running. The island networks. Beyond Japan proper, Seabee construction operations on Pacific Islands created transportation networks that connected isolated communities to relief supplies for the first time since combat had destroyed previous infrastructure. On Okinawa, where the 3-month battle had destroyed approximately 90% of pre-war infrastructure, Seabees built approximately 400 miles of roads connecting Naha and other ports to interior villages. The roads were crude by peacetime standards, often single-lane tracks with occasional passing areas, but they were adequate for supply trucks carrying food and medical supplies to populations that had been isolated during fighting. On Saipan and Tinian, Seabees constructed road networks linking former Japanese settlements to American supply facilities. The roads enabled food distribution to approximately 20,000 Japanese civilians who remained on the islands after combat, populations that faced starvation without external support because local agriculture had been destroyed by fighting. On smaller atolls scattered across Micronesia and Melanesia, Seabee detachments built modest road systems, sometimes just a few miles connecting a port to a settlement, that allowed relief supplies to reach indigenous populations that had been left destitute by war's destruction of traditional fishing and agriculture. The island construction operations were technically less challenging than Japan work, but logistically more complex. Each island required transporting construction equipment across ocean, establishing temporary camps for construction crews, completing work rapidly because crews couldn't remain indefinitely, then moving equipment to next location. The island hopping that had characterized Pacific military operations continued during reconstruction, as construction units moved from atoll to atoll building infrastructure for humanitarian relief. The operational tempo. The speed at which CB battalions completed road construction operations reflected the urgency of humanitarian crisis and the efficiency of military organization applied to civilian purposes. Construction units operated at tempo that would have been unsustainable in civilian context, but that military discipline and urgency made routine. Typical CB work schedules during reconstruction period were brutal by any standard. 12-hour shifts were normal, with crews working dawn to dusk 6 or 7 days weekly. When deadlines demanded, when food distributions were delayed waiting for road completion, when starvation reports came from regions that needed access, crews would work extended shifts that reached 16 or 20 hours. The pace was maintained for months, sustained by military discipline and collective commitment to missions that were saving lives rather than just completing construction projects. The construction equipment utilization rates exceeded anything civilian construction would attempt. Bulldozers and graders operated continuously throughout daylight hours, with minimal downtime for maintenance. When equipment broke down, repairs were expedited using whatever parts were available, often cannibalizing damaged equipment to keep operational machines running. Received food and medical supplies. On Pacific atolls, hundreds of miles of shorter road networks ensured isolated populations weren't forgotten because they couldn't be reached. The humanitarian statistics documented the road's impact. In regions served by CB-built transportation networks, child mortality rates declined approximately 40% between September 1945 and mid-1946, as adequate nutrition and medical care became available. Adult malnutrition symptoms decreased approximately 55% as regular food distribution reached previously isolated populations. Disease mortality attributed to weakened immune systems from malnutrition dropped approximately 60% as both food and medical supplies reached communities via the road networks. The numbers translated to lives saved, not hundreds or thousands, but hundreds of thousands of people who survived because roads allowed food to reach them, because CBs had built infrastructure that humanitarian relief required, because construction expertise had been applied to saving lives rather than just supporting military operations. The final measure. The story of how America's most useless battalion built 5,000 miles of roads to feed starving Japanese islands documented transformation from mockery to respect, earned through performance that couldn't be dismissed. The CBs had proved their value through construction achievements that enabled both military victory and humanitarian relief, demonstrating that building was fighting when infrastructure determined operational success. The 272 CBs, who died in combat zones while building rather than fighting, had died in service as meaningful as any combat death. The 2,341 wounded by enemy action while performing construction operations had sacrificed for missions as critical as any assault. The tens of thousands who'd worked 12-hour shifts under fire, in jungles, through monsoons, on coral. The utilization approach was wasteful of equipment. Machines wore out faster than manufacturers intended, but achieved construction speeds that careful equipment management couldn't match. The supply chains supporting construction operations demonstrated American logistical capabilities applied to humanitarian purposes. Construction materials, equipment parts, fuel, and other necessities flowed to construction sites with reliability that sustained rapid building tempo. When materials ran short, CBs improvised using salvaged resources, steel from destroyed buildings, timber from demolished structures, whatever could be repurposed for construction needs. The roads that fed millions. By mid-1946, when most CB battalions had completed reconstruction missions and were being demobilized or reassigned, The road networks they'd built across Japan and Pacific Islands were functioning transportation systems that sustained humanitarian relief operations, feeding approximately 20 to 25 million people. The roads connected Yokohama and other major ports to Tokyo's neighborhoods, enabling food distribution that prevented starvation in Japan's largest city. They linked Osaka's port to interior regions of Honshu, allowing supplies to reach populations that had been isolated. They connected Hiroshima to surrounding prefectures, ensuring that the devastated city received relief supplies. Across Japan, the 4,000-plus miles of roads that Seabees built created network that transformed food aid from potential to actual, from supplies sitting at ports to meals reaching hungry people. On Okinawa, the 400 miles of roads built by Seabee battalions connected Naha to villages throughout the island, ensuring that the 300,000 civilians who'd survived the battle in heat and through every condition that made construction difficult had served with dedication that proved construction workers in uniform were soldiers who happened to build rather than just fighters who happened to kill. The roads they built became arteries that fed millions, routes that saved lives measured in hundreds of thousands, infrastructure that enabled recovery from war's devastation. The construction operations represented victory measured not in territory captured, but in logistics enabled, not in enemies killed, but in people fed, not in battles won, but in survivors sustained through crisis that would have killed them without the roads that construction workers in uniform had built across thousands of miles of hostile terrain. The battalion that nobody wanted became the battalion that everybody needed, proving that some wars are won with shovels and bulldozers rather than rifles and grenades. That building can be fighting when what's being built determines who survives.